Your training can't prepare you for what you have to do. They don't teach that. I mean, maybe they can't, that, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have to make a choice that you're not going to want to make. They can't really predict because the situations that people are going in are so unpredictable. So they can't say, hey, there's going to be this time when you're going to have moral injury and this is what you're going to think about yourself. And, that's just not a thing, I don't think.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, joined today by Lisa Duez. Lisa is a seasoned LCSW and EMDR-approved consultant with over 2 decades of experience. As the founder of Turning Point Counseling and Consulting, she draws on her leadership experiences to fuel her passion for effective leadership. Lisa created her own solo practice in 2016 and evolved that into a successful group practice in 2019. Beyond her clinical work, Lisa's commitment to fostering empathetic and compassionate communities extends to her support for first responders and her engagement as a speaker, trainer, and organizer of professional development events. Today, we are going to talk about therapy work around moral injury. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Happy to have you, or happy to be here.
Happy for you to be here too. So moral injury is such an interesting type of work to be doing, and I'm not sure a lot of people really know about that type of work. So can you just start with some basic information about what moral injury is?
Yeah, absolutely. So moral injury is not necessarily new. If you remember from literature class, if you remember, the Iliad, Achilles and Patroclus, I never say that right. One of the characters in there had a moral injury because of the death of his friend. And how I've come to see it and understand it is through my work with kind of that really specific clientele, which is first responders and vets. But also I understood it to come back after the pandemic. And a lot of, started to see a lot of literature about healthcare workers having moral injury. And it is simply being put in a situation, and you can see why a lot of vets and healthcare and, first responders have it. It's being put in a situation where you have to make a decision that goes against your core values. So for example, a soldier having to kill a kid, something like that is a kind of a police officer having to hurt someone. We're not taught, we're not, that's not something that we are expecting to do in our life or in our job. So it's like another layer of things to process in therapy. So how you hear about it is people start talking about their own judgments. I did something wrong. It's not diagnosable necessarily at this point, although I have heard it could be something in the DSM-6. I can't even believe we're talking about the DSM-6.
Right.
Because I can remember the DSM-3. So it may show up there, but it is not like PTSD or depression. It is that second layer of this thing happened to me. I have PTSD. I'm depressed. And then also I did something against my core values.
Okay. And I can totally see why the pandemic could be activating that in a lot of people for a variety of reasons. So I imagine people don't necessarily seek out therapy for moral injury. It's more of a kind of a population of people, like you said, that you work with, first responders and people in the healthcare field that come in for therapy. And then that's really underlying everything. So is that something that you typically see where are they even aware of the concept of moral injury?
Not necessarily. They're aware that of the symptoms of depression or PTSD or anxiety. And then as you go through the therapeutic process, they will start to talk about, things that happen to them, judgments that they have against themselves for doing what they were forced to do because probably they didn't have a choice. They were in a situation where there was a job requirement that this happened, or it was a safety situation where they had to make a terrible choice. And so they start to understand that, oh my gosh, this is another layer, kind of as that trauma leaves them, as they reprocess that or understand that to better, then they're left with this guilt, this shame, all kinds of emotions, anger, I did this. I'm ashamed that I did this. I wasn't brought up that way. Why did my commander make me do this? I'm angry at them. I'm angry at the system. I'm angry at myself. So it's that second part of processing that I find that's there, even with people that are not in, I guess, safety situations or healthcare situations. You will see it sometimes with folks that have been maybe gone through abuse. How do I feel about my father? How do I feel about this? How do I, I'm supposed to love my father, but they did this to me. So it's there, and you'll pick up the themes as you work with a client.
Right. So I'm sort of feeling as you're talking about this, that it's way more pervasive than a lot of therapists even are probably recognizing in their work, that they're seeing all those things, but they're not necessarily digging a little bit deeper to see maybe that's the origin of what they're experiencing that's brought them into therapy.
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit more pervasive than what we understand because there is, in trauma therapy, we talk about the event and then we talk about the reaction to the event. And so this is always the reaction to the event. And so sometimes we say, okay, well, if I had this thing happen to me and then I wasn't believed. So there's that secondary trauma that happens for that. But this is kind of like, well, I had this thing happen to me and then I'm a bad person because I did it. I had to do this. I was put in this situation, or my family did this to me and I'm supposed to love my father. I'm supposed to miss my father because he just passed away, but I'm glad that he's not here anymore. I've had people say that to me, and that in
Yeah.
itself morality, because we are all born moral, right? We come out of the womb, we're moral people. It's society and environmental that kind of causes us to question ourselves.
Yeah. And then a lot of these are situations where it's really out of somebody's control, whether it's childhood abuse or, job related. And I feel like that's something that I'm seeing more and more of in the therapy realm for therapists. With I do some fictionalized consultation groups where I bring together therapists that I don't know, and we process cases. And one of them involved a therapist that was working with somebody whose values were very different than their own. And we come in taught to be blank slates, which I don't think is possible as a human,
Right.
because we are humans first and then therapists. But sometimes, especially since the pandemic, I feel like people are more abrupt and blunt about their thoughts about things. And so there are times that I'm hearing therapists sitting in the therapy room where someone is saying something that's opposing their race or their identity in some way, or their ethnicity or their sexuality, and having to sit there feeling angry, and we're not trained to be able to navigate that at all in our work.
Right. I think, yeah, I absolutely have had that experience personally and have supervised people that have had that experience. And I think everybody, and also to add the layer, everybody wants to know, like, okay, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this? Because in order for me to work with you, I have to know these things. And first of all, our judgment, we're not supposed to say. And second of all, I've had people really grapple with, I don't agree with this person and I'm supposed to provide therapy. So I think there's a morality part to that. Therapy is, I always feel like therapists it's a kind of a calling. And so when we
Mm-hmm.
have a calling, we're more apt to be, I think it's more of a, I don't want to say spiritual, but maybe spiritual understanding that it's not just a job for a lot of people. It's a way of life. And so, yes, this stuff does play into it, because there's a
Absolutely.
spiritual component to morality, and to heal from it, you do have to get to that second plane of who am I at my core.
Hmm. Yeah, and the issues of self were just not taught to navigate really in grad school at all, even down to therapists who have now had this experience with a client that was so upsetting to them and feeling like they can't refer out because we're not really taught a lot of skills about referring out. And so then they're stuck with this, do I have to keep working with this person? No, you don't. If you're out there listening and the question is, do
No,
I have to keep
no,
working with this person? No,
absolutely
you don't.
not. Yeah.
As long as you refer out ethically and professionally, it is absolutely okay to refer someone out for our own needs.
And I think we should. I mean, I think self-care is an ethical issue, and I think you should refer out. And I think if you can't find that you can work with someone, I've certainly been in that situation, and you try, and I think it's okay to try, but sometimes it doesn't work out. So yeah,
Absolutely.
you're supposed to. It's a
Right.
judgment. It's a judgment call, and it's a conscious decision, and I think it can be very high stakes. If you can't do it, you can actually end up hurting the client worse. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sometimes,
And that's
yeah,
something that people in
wow.
our field, people around those of us in our field don't really understand that there's so much of ourselves that we put into our work. It takes so much
Absolutely,
of
yeah,
us. And then we're not only we doing the work, but we're processing our own and stuff internally and figuring things out about what someone's saying and how we need to support them and how I feel about needing to support them around that issue.
yeah, yeah. It's this battle, kind of, which it's a battle between, what is human and what is ethical. I think it boils down to, and then with a client, it shows up in this: I have to heal from this trauma, and then I have to resolve why it happened and the fact that I didn't have control over these things, and it went sideways or whatever. And then with a therapist, it's kind of like, hey, I don't agree with this person. Can I give this person the best services? Probably not in some instances. And so there are other people that can. And then it's also obviously telling the client that. And do you want to tell them, hey, I can't work with you because we don't agree?
Right, right.
There's a moral issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And as I said, our world has changed so much since the beginning of the pandemic that people are so much more outspoken. And so things that maybe they would have shied away from a little bit. I mean, I have, no therapist and myself work with clients who came at me really strongly with specific political beliefs.
Questions. They want to know it
And
all. Yeah, they do.
absolutely.
They want to
Yeah.
know where you stand. And to a point, I guess they have an ask about that because they want to heal themselves, and they have a buy into their own healing. So they want to understand some of the more specific things that they're talking about. They need to know where we're at.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So,
again, that goes back to another area we're taught, that we shouldn't self-disclose. I don't support that at all. I think there can be some
yeah,
very healthy self-disclosing if it's done
yeah,
appropriately. But there are times we don't want to self-disclose about things like that. And so
absolutely. Yeah.
in
Mhm.
the moment on the fly, we're figuring out like,
Yeah, we are. And
do I want to bring this up? How can we shift? How can I get them onto something
yes,
else?
we are master shifters. Yes, we are. We are master
Absolutely.
shifters. I think it's, yeah. I was talking with someone in supervision about that today. We were just talking about, she said the person had asked her, does she go to church? It was just a blanket statement. Do you go to church? And she said, yes, I do. And he goes, oh, okay, great. And that was the end of the conversation. And she's like, should I have said if I go to church? And I said, well, yeah, because you didn't say I go to church and I'll go to this church and I'm inviting you. I said, you just answered the question. You just said yes. And
Absolutely.
and I think she goes, well, what if he asks another question? I said, then we'll deal with it when he asks another question. I said,
Right.
maybe that's all he needed. She
Right.
didn't do wrong by saying, yeah, come on, and we're having this, and no, she just said yes.
Right. I think that's an evolution we're seeing in our field as well, that we are finding consumers are much more savvy about being able to choose the therapist they work with and
Mhm.
wanting a therapist that has commonalities with them, or a therapist that understands specific aspects of themselves. And so sometimes those beginning sessions are them trying to feel you out. Sometimes it's done ahead of time and sometimes it's not. And then they're trying to feel you out because a lot of clients who've never been in therapy before don't even really understand, like, what are the rules? Am I allowed to talk about religion? Am I allowed to talk about sex? Am I allowed to tell you about the 5 arrests that I had? All of those things.
Yeah.
And so
Or
normalizing it for clients that, yeah, we can talk about those things if you want
yeah,
to.
keep your secrets. Yep.
Yeah,
It's a
absolutely.
relationship at its very core. It's a relationship. It's a therapeutic relationship, but it's a relationship.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when
So
you, yeah, go ahead.
does the origin of the moral injury inform the way you're working at all?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's like, sometimes it's not evident, when you first meet with someone, although sometimes it is evident when you're doing an intake. And, I think the cues are, okay, this person is now talking about something that happened to them, and they're bringing judgment questions. They're not talking about, PTSD stuff. They're not talking about fear necessarily. They're not talking about depression, or they're not talking about anxiety. They're not giving you symptoms of those diagnoses. They're giving you self-judgment. And when you get that self-judgment from them, I should have this, I should have that, I was put in this situation, then that's your clue that there is that other layer of, like, something's going on. I need to, they feel a certain way about what happened to them. So I need to also integrate that in treatment. And I might say to them, hey, you're saying to me that you're judging yourself. Do you feel that you did something against your own morals? And they'll maybe sometimes say yes. I
Okay.
can't, when they can't resolve it, in that way, when it's not non-symptomatic. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, it's a little bit of psychoeducation, which we do a lot of, in throwing out the right questions to figure out, help them identify. Maybe you see that they're experiencing this thing that they really
mhm.
never even maybe actively thought of it as an issue, because, especially around job related things, I would
Yeah,
imagine
because I
it's your
was doing
job. You're supposed.
my training. This is what I was supposed to do. But then they come home. If, for example, if they're at a soldier and they come home and they start to really understand what actually happened, they're out of that role, because that when you have soldiers and police, they're in that role, and often healthcare workers, that's the hat they put on, and it's a very intense, all-consuming hat. So then they have space, and they're like, oh my gosh, I had to do that.
Yeah.
I can't believe I have to do that. And so then it's like, when you start to talk about them, like about the what happened. And for me, it's EMDR and reprocessing the trauma. I leave the moral injury part alone for a little bit, because we're going to get through the trauma part first, and then we're going to go back. And sometimes, as they reprocess the trauma, they can adaptively understand, okay, I was put in this situation because I did the right, they resolve it within themselves. They resolve the
Mhm.
benevolence of it, and they understand, okay, I had to do this. It was just something I had to do. It does not mean I am a bad person. I had to do this.
Yes. So Lisa and I both live in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, where we have like the largest number of bases, I think, in the world.
Yeah. Yep.
And so we work with military a whole lot. And I often see with soldiers and sailors that they just learn to stuff their feelings. And
They
that
do.
really has such a huge impact on their marriage and their family. I can see that this would be such a gift for them to be able to explore this and deal with it and be free on some level of this, so that then they can go back to, okay, I don't just have to, ignore all my feelings, but I can actually have feelings and put that in another box.
Yeah, they compartmentalize it because they have to get through the day. And then I guess when they let the box out, or the roles, they're out of the military, they understand it, like, oh my gosh, I did this. I worked with a guy that had some moral injury from World War II. He was in his 70s or maybe 80s, I don't know, but it was that long ago.
Yeah.
Um, and so they carry it with them. And he said, you always remember what happened. and always, it's not, he's since resolved a long time ago about what happened and how it happened, but it was the part that he had to do something against the way he was raised.
Right. So
Yeah.
learning to accept that it happened and not try to pretend it didn't happen, but be able to take some of those intense emotions away from it and look at it a little more objectively
But
so
more
that you can
objectively,
find a little more peace.
yeah, a little bit more of, understanding it, and a little bit more of this is that it was a moment in time, and a little bit more of, kind of the restorative aspect of it. I've heard of restorative justice, I'm sure, where, you kind of make amends to someone, kind of that piece of therapy where you kind of make amends to what happened. So the restoration of yourself based on how you feel and what happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
Restoration of your view of self.
Of your view of self. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that you might have had to do the situation, you had to do the situation because if this wouldn't have happened, this would have happened, and this would have been worse. And so constantly what I say, I think to a lot of people, is you made the best decision that you knew how to do at the time. And that's like with moral injury, I think it's something that they have to understand, that at that time they did the best thing they could,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
That they were following their training, they were following their orders, they were keeping themselves safe. They were just in a very situation that they maybe couldn't win, but they did the best they could.
Right.
So
Right.
it's hard. It's definitely taxing work. It's definitely work where I have to shake it off a little bit sometimes because it's rough. So I would say I think you'll know if you have a client with moral injury, you'll understand it because you'll be thinking about it a little bit more than just the normal, oh, he has PTSD. There's this extra layer that you'll be like, oh, wow, okay.
Right. And
Now
I
I
would
get,
imagine a lot of seasoned therapists who are listening to this are going to think, oh, yeah, I didn't even know that's what I was treating.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I'm working with these people that came in with trauma. I'm trauma, informed, I'm trauma trained, and I'm doing this deeper layer that I just never really put a name on it before.
yeah. I started to read about it, I guess, when I think it was one of my clients said it's a moral issue, and I would Google moral issues in treatment, and I was like, oh, this moral injury. Then just started to see all this research post pandemic, but then also with my clients that I work with a lot that just have it. And then disclosure, I'm married to a police officer. So he'll come in and talk about different things that happened, and then he'll talk about how he feels about them. And, there's been moral issues. There's been, I shouldn't have done this. And like, hey, you did the best you could.
I have a family member in law enforcement as well, and just understanding some of the things that they're exposed to
Yeah,
that, it's unimaginable if you're not in that job,
right,
much
right.
like a lot that the military does.
And your training can't, I think what I understand from working with people, your training can't prepare you for what you have to do. They don't teach that. I mean, maybe they can't, that you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have to make a choice that you're not going to want to make. They can't really predict because the situations that people are going in are so unpredictable. So they can't say, hey, there's going to be this time when you're going to have moral injury and this is what you're going to think about yourself. And that's just not a thing, I don't think.
Just like going into the therapy field, there are so many
Yeah,
things that, we come into it because we want to help people, but we don't know about the legal things that we can deal with, the
yeah,
ethical things that we have to deal with,
right.
all of the many, many gray areas we're going to have to deal
Yeah.
with.
Hey, therapist, your client is going to want to know your political view, and your graduate school person told you not to say it. So what are you going
Right.
to do?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Or
that is one of the reasons for this podcast, and something that I believe in a whole lot with the consultation groups that I facilitate, is normalizing what we are experiencing in our work, and
yeah.
creating an avenue for people to be able to open up and discuss it, because that's important in this work, to be able to talk to people who truly get the depth of the work that we do, and the conundrums that we're sometimes in with clients.
Yeah, because sometimes there's not the right, I always tell people about the textbooks, the therapy textbooks, the ones where it's like client said this, therapist said this, and it's like perfect, right? It's like this
Hmm.
focused page that's like, oh man, if it only worked that way, you know? And then I'm
Right.
like, yeah, my my clinicians will be like, I did this and I cussed too much. And I'm like, that's fine. You're all right. Or, or it didn't work out quite that way. And I'm like, well, that's called the art of therapy, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't always
Yeah.
work the way we think.
And the longer you do the job, the more you realize that, even with a lot of experience, there's going to be times when you went right instead of left. And afterwards you're thinking, oh, I should have gone left, but I went right. And I
Yeah.
will find that I will, really process those internally a lot, think about them a lot, maybe sometimes even feel badly about it. And then the next time I've had clients come back and say, last session was the best one we've ever
Yeah.
had. And I'm like,
And
oh,
you're
that's
thinking, I
great.
was going to talk to you about that, about me not misstepping last week. And it's just, yeah, it's absolutely. You can't be too hard on yourself because honestly, sometimes I think it's a human experience. We're human beings and we're having a human experience. And it's cool that we get to have, every day we get to have relationships with people, therapeutic relationships with people that people don't usually to the level that people don't get to, that we
Right.
understand people's psyches and selves and that it's just, yeah, we're also trying to understand our psyches and selves at the same time,
Yes.
our own morality. So yeah,
Right.
there's all that.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of us tend to sort of lean towards working with clients that have some aspect of ourselves in common.
We do.
And so that can also create that other layer that, okay, so we do have this thing in common, and that can make it really good because I got some on the job training with life. But there are also
Yeah.
times that you're like, oh, that's pushing a button that doesn't feel very good
Or
today.
she did that and she's in therapy for that and I did the same thing and
Right.
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
It's funny. Yeah. We are all doing the best that we can.
we
Absolutely.
are. Absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
an option and you are doing the best that you can.
I agree so much. Yeah. So, are there any clinical challenges that come to mind when you're doing this type of work? Things to be aware of, things to, I mean, so you just obviously you build rapport first, you're dealing with what, the initial trauma, and then you're going into that deeper layer.
Yeah, I think, if you're dealing with someone that has a moral issue, and for example, they say something to you that they did wrong and that was morally wrong, and also you think is morally wrong, because, we're just to use the example that we did before about someone hurting a child, we would never feel that that was right in any circumstances. And in your head, you might be thinking, well, oh my gosh, this person hurt a child. How did they do that? So you got to watch your own judgments there because some of the things that you're hearing, you are not familiar with. And some of the training that they have to go through. And so we can be also quick to judge, I think. So we have to be careful about kind of checking ourselves, and just, sometimes it's like, all right, we're going to get through. And I just say to them, listen, we're going to get through this. You're going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. And we're going to get through this too. But I think you got to understand that, it's just what you hear in therapy. That's sometimes not, puppies and rainbows.
Right.
Um,
That secondary trauma can be really
yeah.
intense.
And then
Absolutely.
sometimes when you have moral injury, you're hearing some stuff that can be traumatic because, it's not good stuff. Um,
Right.
so checking yourself, secondary trauma, making sure that you get your own self-care. Obviously I know you talk about that all the time, but, also what I will say on the flip side is some of these clients are so thankful to be able to start to talk about these things that they have carried for so long that you will be an absolute blessing to them. That
Yes.
that you are that person that's going to help them sleep at night or, not beat themselves up for things that they felt like they had to do or were told to do. Um,
Right.
on the flip side of that, it's going to be some of the most rewarding work you probably have ever done.
Right. Yeah. And I was just thinking that one of the gifts for therapists that I think you can recognize the longer you're in the field is that, when people open up about those things, how precious it is and what a big responsibility it is. But also, I feel like for my own self, I'm so less judgmental of people in general
Absolutely.
because you've seen the things that people have experienced. You've seen the human underneath that experience. You've sat with that person in tears, and it's easier to understand that probably most of the people walking around you at any given moment are dealing with something big in their lives or
Yeah,
disturbing or uncomfortable. And they're just trying to get through the day and they don't need people
absolutely.
giving them a
Yeah,
hard time.
absolutely. It gives you a sense of humanity, and it understands that you're right. We're all just trying to get through it. You know, kindness goes a heck of a long way. You know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's good work. It's deep work, but it's good work.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, so I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to talk about the conference you have coming up next year in Virginia Beach. I'm so excited
I
that we
know,
have an
thank you
East
for letting
Coast
me talk
conference
about
coming
that.
up.
Yeah, so my business partner and we decided, and maybe it was the pandemic, and maybe it's because I'm like this extroverted person and I'd love to bring people together. So we're having a conference called the Clinician Connection Conference, and it's April 18th and 19th, 2024. It's in Virginia Beach, Virginia, so you can come see our hometown. It's at the Hilton Garden Inn. It's right on the oceanfront. All of the rooms are oceanfront. We've got a great room rate. We've got some great speakers. So what I will say about the speakers is that, and the topics that we picked clinical topics, and then we found speakers that worked on clinical topics. So for example, I'm going to be presenting with a friend of mine that's a law enforcement officer, and we're going to talk about what it's like to work with law enforcement officers. Because guess what? Law enforcement officers are now coming to therapy more, and it's
Yes.
fantastic. We're going to have someone to talk about creativity. We're going to have someone to talk about working with the LGBTQ plus community. We're going to have someone to talk about eating disorders. So those topics that are really hard for therapists to understand, we probably have someone to talk about that. So
That's
we would love
wonderful.
you to come. The website is clinicianconnection.net, but I am going to drop it on my Facebook page. Probably, I'm just on Facebook as my name, or we'll have probably a link at Turning Point Counseling and Consulting in Virginia Beach. But I believe registration will open, we are hoping September 1st, which is Friday.
Oh,
Um,
it is. I can't believe it.
I
Yeah.
know summer went quick.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's definitely, we'll put that in the show notes as well. So if people are listening to this, they can be able to access information about
Yeah.
that because
And
you want participants, but you also want sponsors and you also probably want some
yeah,
volunteers to help with things. It takes a
money,
lot of
and
people to run something like that.
it does. I'm learning that. I'm learning that. And also, I will say we are a CE provider. So there are CEs available to NBCC. So we wouldn't have a conference without giving people some CEs.
Okay, so
So
NBCC.
CEs, yep, NBCC CEs, yes.
Okay.
I had to
Great,
like
great.
gloss it. Yeah.
Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, I'm super excited about that. And that's a beautiful hotel right on the ocean front.
Yeah, it's really pretty. We fell in love. It's a nice little funky place. The conference suite is kind of up and away from everyone, and there's a huge patio. I just can't wait. There's a nice
Yeah.
restaurant. I can't wait. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. That's wonderful. Okay. All right. So I would love if you could share with us a favorite analogy or metaphor that you like to use in therapy.
Oh, okay. So the one thing I'm looking at my thing I have on my wall. The one thing that my supervisor told me that I tell clients is that if nothing changes, nothing changes.
Hmm.
And so that means that if you don't change anything, nothing's going to change. And I know that is so obvious, right? It's just like of course, if you don't change anything, nothing's going to change. But also, it's not, because people come to therapy and they just come and they start talking, and that's what we're supposed to do. But sometimes you want to have people like, let's try this in your life, or let's do this. And so if you change nothing, you're going to get the same result. And so I always say that a lot, sometimes to myself. And I have it on my wall, and clients are like, oh, yeah, if nothing changes, nothing changes. Ha ha. Well, it's true.
And we've all had experiences with clients that they don't really get that only some of the work is done in the therapy room, but a lot
Right.
of the work is done in between sessions. And they show up having done nothing in between the sessions. And I'm not even big on giving homework, but little suggestions here and there, tips
Yeah.
or, suggestions, and they don't do it. And they're like, I don't think therapy's for me. It's not really working. and,
Right.
and
I'm like,
you're like,
what have we done different here? Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
that's
And that can be a huge frustration for therapists. I've talked to many, many therapists. They're like, I don't know what to do with this client. I'm like, well, the old thing that we've always say is you can't be working harder with your client than your
right. And
client.
that's
The
exactly.
client's got to be putting the work in.
Yeah. And so I'm like, well, have you changed anything? You come in here and talk, and I laugh with them. I'm like, my magic wand is broken. So you have to do something. I'm going to go get it fixed, but I don't think I'm going to get it fixed this week. So
Yes,
nothing
absolutely.
changes, nothing
Yeah.
changes. That's
Mm-hmm.
what I tell them.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Lisa, I'll do something. Yeah,
Yes. I love the eye roll.
I do the eye roll. Yeah, that's when you got them. Eye roll.
That's right. That's right. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, Lisa, it's been so nice talking with you today and having you here. So
it's
I'm
been
going
great.
to put the information that you shared in the show notes. So you gave the name of that website. Are there other ways that people can connect with you outside of just the conference,
Mhm.
your group practice and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm at Turning Point Counseling and Consulting. So that's turningpointva.com. And then just LDUEZ at turningpointva.com is my email. Happy to
Great.
talk to
Okay.
anyone.
Yeah, wonderful. I will definitely be putting that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Yes. So it's been wonderful having you here today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to see a fellow Virginia Beacher.
Absolutely. Yep.
Mhm.
So, for everyone listening, there are new episodes of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast released every Thursday on all major platforms. Please remember our work is hard, but it does not have to be lonely. Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.